Welcome to Settling the Score.
This week, the birth of Western classical music, Part 1. Hello, and welcome to Settling the Score podcast. I'm Brody.
And I'm Ronnie, working our way towards ranking classical composers from the 9th century to the now. And today, we are finally getting around to talking about Western classical music. Well, that is to say, we're getting around to talking about the ancestry, the direct and immediate ancestry of Western classical music. We are going to explore the two parent strains that lead to the conception of our great tradition. And next week, we will follow from conception to actual birth and finally arrive at Western classical music and ranking.
Finally!
Yes! So we hope that we have entertained you all up until this point. And we are going to kick things off with another Rexipod recommendation. Just a brief caveat, though. Listeners, I have to admit I have not yet listened to the Rexipod that we are about to recommend, which is usually dangerous business, but I'm going to go ahead and take the risk because everybody in the community says these guys are fantastic, and they are the next Rexipod that I want to listen to after I get caught up with So You Think You Can Rule Persia. And that ties right into the reason we're showcasing them in this episode, because one of the two parent strains, as you may have guessed, is ancient Greek music, and the podcast that we're about to recommend is the Alexander Standard.
Hello, my name is Meredith.
And my name is Dustin.
And we're the host of
The Alexander Standard. That's better. Inspired by Rex Factor Podcast, we rank all the successors of Alexander the Great, from Perdiccas
to Cleopatra VII.
After Alexander the Great died, really hit the fan.
Seriously, the Hellenistic world was a crazy place.
And we've got some crazy stories to tell you.
So please come check out our show, The Alexander Standard.
I love that little march music they got going on there.
Yeah.
How the bass is kind of like, it's like flubby tight, if that makes any sense. It's like a little bit flubby, but it's so like, right on the beat. Good choice, guys. Next, I'll be able to say something substantive about your podcast. But look, let's not waste any time. We're going to get started with a little question, actually. So, Brody, I am going to ask you a question right now that I will ask you again at the end of the series.
Okay.
When you can look back on it all. But I want to ask you right now, what is Western classical music?
I guess it would be any music during a certain time period in Europe. I'm guessing like 1600s to early or late 1800s, something like that.
Okay. So how would we account for the classical music that came out in the 20th century and from other parts of the world like the United States or Asia?
Modern classical music.
Oh, yeah. Well, I guess, that's actually fair if I say Western. This is interesting because the Western classical tradition, when we use the term Western now, it basically means any music that falls into that category, even if it's not from the West.
Yeah.
But, okay. Do you want to say anything else about it?
No.
Okay. Well, hey, like you said, your knowledge of this area is fairly...
Very limited.
Yeah. Compared to like all the other genres, you guys might find out Brody is a real genre junkie. He just like spends his time looking for weird cult subgenres that nobody else knows about.
Yeah, I know just about every one of the 400 subgenres of metal.
Yep. Yeah, especially metal subgenres. The guy's an absolute encyclopedia.
Yeah.
So
yeah, there are subtle differences between them, you know.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Like alien technical death metal is quite different than blackened alien technical death metal, you know.
You'll have to show me some examples after we record.
Yeah.
So I obviously love metal and rock and roll and all these things, as you guys probably know from all the metal and rock and roll clips and references we make in this show, scaring off the true believers in the Western classical cause. But don't worry, guys, you're going to get more classical music than your brains have room for. I promise you that. At any rate, I'm going to ask myself the same question now, and I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to ask myself to describe, in 3 words or less, what is Western classical music.
That old shit.
Yep. That old shit and some of the new shit that grew from the old shit, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It gotta sound like the old shit.
Yeah, that's right. But that's not going to cover it for us. There are a couple different angles we could take this from. We could attack it from the aesthetic angle. We could attack it from the historical angle. But I'm going to tackle it from the technical angle. I'm going to be very blunt, almost crude in my answer. Notation and polyphony. Now, wait. Other cultures have notation and polyphony, do they not? Yes, they do. But no one has developed a system of notation as precise and as nuanced as the Western classical tradition, and no one has developed the level of sophisticated polyphony that the West has achieved throughout the history of our classical tradition. For those of you who don't know what polyphony is, it means multiple voices. And I think that, no, actually, we did mention this in our Egypt episode, so I'm not going to go back over it again. But it's multi-voiced music, meaning that you have different voices, or as in this case, voice means any part. So you have multiple parts that are singing or playing different lines, and they complement one another or contrast with one another. That's the polyphony part. That's something that we will be looking at a bit later. But in the meantime, we can start talking about notation pretty early on, and we're going to start our exploration into Western classical music by looking at a couple of the earliest examples of notation that are relevant in some way to the classical tradition. So we know that India had notation and has notation. We know that China had and has notation. We know that the ancient Sumerians had notation, and actually, that's where we're going to start. So go ahead, Brody.
The earliest notation.
The earliest fragment of musical notation is found on a 4,000-year-old Sumerian clay tablet, which includes instructions and tunings for a hymn honoring the ruler Lipit Ishtar. It dates to roughly 1950 BC, and you might want to swing over here, Brody, because I want to show you what the notation looks like.
Whoa.
Yeah.
That's musical notation.
That is musical notation.
Wow.
So some very, very smart people can look at this and be like, yep, we have a rough idea of what this probably is. Now, there's no translation instructions here. So some people had to do some very, very clever reverse engineering to translate it into something that we can perform and listen to today. And Brody, would you be terribly surprised at this point if I told you that Ann Kilmer was involved?
No, I would not.
She's our gal. She was one of the major figures in, I'd mentioned earlier, deciphering Sumerian notation. And this is what I was talking about specifically.
Nice.
So that's what it looks like. Now, let's give a listen to what it sounds like. I should first of all tell you that this is not a piece of music per se. This is a set of instructions. I should say, I'm sorry, there are instructions for how to play another piece of music that was related to this, but we don't have the surviving music itself, only the instructions.
I don't need no instructions to know how to rock.
I think that's what your buddy Ugg said.
Right.
Yeah.
Rock.
Rock. Okay, he's gonna still keep coming up. Anyway, here we go. Did you recognize the scale?
Yeah. I can't remember the name of that particular scale.
It probably sounds a bit like a major scale, but it's not exactly.
A little bit.
It's pretty close, but it's not exactly. Because instead of going do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, it's going sol, la, ti, do, re, mi, fa, sol. Meaning it's a Mixolydian scale.
Ooh.
So, do you remember when I said we know they used a kind of modified major scale? Mm-hmm. This is what I was talking about. And there are things that Anne and other people have done to figure out that this seemed to be the master scale. This is also why I was able to show you things like that really beautiful Aeolian piece that we heard. I don't know if you'll remember it now, but if I played it for you, you would. And it's all based on this scale. So they seem to have modes, and essentially we can trace some of our earliest ideas about modes and scales, at least back this far. Now, regardless of how accurately they interpreted it, it's just a set of instructions for how to play a hymn, not the notation for the hymn itself. For that, you need to consult with the Hurrians.
The Hurrian Hymn, number 6.
So the Hurrians were a people from Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey, whose territory wove through and overlapped with some of the larger neighboring powers, like the Hittites and the Mitanni. But they were their own cultural group of Ugaritic origin. A tiny bit more on Ugarit in a little bit, but for now, what about this music? The Hurrian hymn number 6, to the orchard goddess Nikal, is the oldest notated song in the world. And guess what? The writer was kind enough to leave us with instructions on how to play it.
Nice, good.
So we not only have the piece, but we also have the instructions explaining how the notation actually works. And now it's funny because that doesn't mean that there aren't still like 6 zillion interpretations of it, because there are. But it doesn't really matter because we do have one probably relatively authoritative interpretation, again, involving Ann Kilmer and a guy named Michael Levy, who we're about to hear. The argument for accuracy is a bit technical and depends quite a bit on the understanding of the notation, which we neither have nor will acquire. I mean, what you guys do on your own time is completely up to you, but we're not touching this with a 39.5-foot pole because we've got other work to do. Thank you very much. But we are going to listen to it because it's amazing and beautiful. And, I don't mind pointing you guys in the direction. So we've linked to a scholarly article that summarizes all of the arguments for different interpretations so that you can go ahead and read it and make your own decision. As all the conspiracy theorists around the world keep telling you, do your own research and try not to wind up in a grave for it. So, in this article, you can find evidence of things like heptachords and harmonic pairings and even proto-phoberdon.
Proto-phoberdon?
Yep.
What is that?
That's a $30 musical word that you're going to become very familiar with by the time we get to, just about the middle of the 15th century.
Nice.
Don't worry about it right now. But if you guys out there know what phoberdon is, you are obviously an early music performer, or you just learned about it in music history this year, and you haven't had enough time to forget about it. So yes, there are still a zillion possible interpretations, but for our I's and P's, all we need to know is that the people who know more than anybody else in the world about this hymn say it sounded like this. What do you think of that?
And that was incredibly familiar, and I can't put my finger on where I've heard that before. Maybe like all of music throughout all of history?
Don't laugh. He's actually onto something. In fact, Brody is correct to say that this piece reminds him of all of music throughout all of history because, as we've discovered so far, the major scale and at least 2 of its modes have been with us throughout, all of history. And on a compositional level, the Hurrian hymn is essentially just a collection of stepwise melodic fragments that move up and down sequentially to outline a few of the perfect fifths that we find in the Dorian mode. So like, sol, fa, mi, re, do, te, do, re, mi, fa. Then this little cadential formula based around the fifth degree of the scale. This sol, fa, sol. All of that's very familiar. It should be by now. So, absolutely, I am standing by my goofy and lovable co-host on this one. Plus, this time 3 years from now, man, I'll show him a piece like this and he'll be like, yeah, Ronnie, I recognize that scale. It's the Dorian mode. And I'll say, Brody, how do you know it's the Dorian mode, brother, and not the Aeolian? And he'll say, well, obviously because of the D natural. If it was Aeolian, it would have been a D flat. In the meantime, huzzah for intuition. Yeah, I think the mode is familiar.
Yeah.
It's basically a Dorian mode, although some scholars have actually interpreted it to be more Aeolian, like a natural minor. But those seem to be the interpretations. So again, we've got this heptatonic scale that is arranged diatonically. That's in whole steps and half steps. And it seems to be indicative of a mode that we're familiar with, because obviously these had to come from somewhere. And it just seems like these modes and these scales are a lot older than we thought that they were. You know, we've been hearing major scales going all the way back to like literally the Stone Age in our series. Remember the national anthem being played on that little bone vulture flute?
Yeah,
You know?
that was really cool.
So that was a major scale. We've been dealing with the major mode for thousands and tens of thousands of years. Unbelievably, but true. I would, as a matter of fact, encourage you all to explore other interpretations of this piece as well. You'd be surprised how many modern artists have covered and interpreted it. We're going to include a video from YouTuber Samurai Guitarist, who, by the way, has one of the best guitar channels on YouTube. He's a super knowledgeable guy and philosophically engaging with tons of practical tips and techniques. So you can see what he has to say about it from that link.
The parent strains.
Neither the traditions of ancient Sumer nor of ancient Anatolia led to Western classical music. The two parent strains for our tradition are the ancient Hebrew and the ancient Greek.
Jews in history.
The ancient Hebrews?
The ancient Hebrews.
If anybody got offended by
Don't worry, I'm Jewish. It's okay.
yeah. So this show is going to be it's going to be a catastrophe, because here's going to be me making blind jokes and you making Jew jokes because we can get away with them.
It's gonna be a show tonight.
It show tonight. It show tonight. Sing it. It show tonight. It show tonight. It's going to be a show tonight.
Hebrew origins, according to the Bible.
Okay, some of you know this story very well, and others don't. I am going to be mildly flippant as I tell you the story, but only because I was in a silly mood and I thought it was funny the way that I wrote it, and I'm not scrapping it. So, here's how it worked out. About 1800 BC, a guy named Abram realizes that there's only one God and all the other gods are frauds. The one true God was so impressed with this observation that he made an everlasting covenant with the guy that all the land between the Nile and Euphrates now belonged to him and his descendants forever. I mean, they'd have to kick out the current inhabitants, but God would help with that when the day finally arrived. For now, Abraham's grandson Jacob picked up this cool nickname, Israel, because he wrestled an angel once, and Israel means he who wrestles with angels. Actually, it means he who wrestles with God, but in those days, the messengers of God kind of functioned as basically God's stand-in, so it works just as well. Anywho, Jacob had 12 sons who each became the head of a tribe. They were one big happy family after getting the youngest brother back some 20 years after his older brothers sold him into slavery out of jealousy, then lied to their dad that his favorite son was killed by wild beasts, torn to shreds. But seriously, no bad blood, because the youngest brother Joseph was so good at interpreting dreams that he got in good with the Pharaoh himself while he was slaving it up in the ancient crib of the Kemites.
And then he went to theater school, and then he came back in this big-ass rainbow trench coat and thinks he's top shit.
Yeah, well, he got a new one because his brothers screwed up his original coat of many colors.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when he got into theater, he decided that he was going to change the name of his multicolored raincoat to the multicolored dream coat. Because he's a dreamer.
No.
Dreamer of dreams. Now, I know what you're thinking, and no, not Technicolor, multicolor. Technicolor had not been invented yet, and this is a very high-class podcast. We only deal in hard historical facts. So, now look, his interpretive skills led to Pharaoh stocking up in advance for a famine that was about to roll in. And Egypt had so much food that everyone else came to them paying good money to live and not to die. And that's how his brothers found him, in fact. They were starving, so they went to Egypt. He recognized them, got super triggered, but had the good presence of mind to step away and just break down in private. Then he lets them know who he is, after messing with them a little bit, of course, and scaring them into thinking that they're not going to get anything and who the hell do you think you are and all that. But finally he broke down and just said, look, here's who I am, I know who you are. And, after a whole lot of the other brothers realizing that they'd been terrible, terrible people because ancient history, they were genuinely sorry and they made their confession to their father after all those years. Now, Jacob was a bit miffed with his other sons, but also overjoyed to see Joseph again. I don't know why I went into so much detail here. I just think it's a cool story. It's one of my favorite ones in the Bible. And it's right there in the front, right in the book of Genesis, so pretty easy to find. Anyway, somehow Joe's descendants fared a lot less well with the pharaohs, because next time we hear anything, it's 400 years later, and now everyone's enslaved, not just Joe. And it looks just like the opening of the Ten Commandments movie. It's exactly what it looks like in Egypt. That is also where I will refer you if you'd like the full story of Moses, because I'm not going to go into it here. But essentially, the Cliff's Notes for Moses' life are that baby Moses' mom had a master's degree in basket weaving, which is super helpful because he needed to be hidden from the Pharaoh since Pharaoh wanted to kill him. Shortly thereafter, he's discovered in some bulrushes by an Egyptian princess. Grows up in the royal house, meets a helpful burning bush one day that says, hey, I'm God and you're actually Hebrew. So go tell Pharaoh to let my people go or I'm going to F his day so hard he's going to wish he was never born twice.
Them's fighting words.
Them's real fighting words.
Northern Africa's about to learn.
That's right, that's right. Well, God kept hardening Pharaoh's heart because free will. So he sent 10 plagues that got worse and worse as they went along, until finally the angel of death himself stepped in and killed all the firstborn sons, including Pharaoh's heir. Then he opened this letter that came from God that said, how do you like me now? So, Pharaoh finally decides, all right, I'm going to let them go. Then he changes his mind, gives chase, gets drowned in the Red Sea. And by the way, now this is kind of interesting. There are actually an inordinate number of chariot parts that have been discovered at the bottom of the Red Sea. Not enough to constitute the large army that the Bible described, but clearly enough that whatever happened, there must have been some kind of historical memory of something happening. Because, like I said, there's a bunch of stuff down there. Not enough for a full army, but enough to make you say, Just like the fact that the number one candidate for Mount Sinai actually has a burnt top. So, look, I'm not saying this is evidence that the scriptural account is right. I'm saying that it's evidence that something happened in history, something very galvanizing obviously happened to make these stories last so long. And what it is, we don't really know, but there are some interesting things going on there. Speaking of that, it's off to Mount Sinai to scoop up the 10 Commandments while everyone else worshipped a brazen bull at the foot of the mountain, because for some weird reason, everybody decided they wanted to pick a fight with God that day. And they thought, what is the single most obnoxiously offensive thing that we could possibly do to piss off God while his number one man is going up there getting the laws for us to live by? So they did that, but no worries. Moses has the commandments, the bull is melted, some basic training begins that lasts about 40 years while the Israelites train up in the desert to invade Canaan, which is the land that God had promised to Abraham. Meantime, Moses knocks up a foreign chick, so God got real pissed at him and told him he can't go into the promised land himself. Instead, this dude Joshua will lead the army and they'll finally get around to clearing those inhabitants with God's help. TLDR, they get the job done, set up a decentralized kingdom of judges, and keep that going until they decide they want a king, because all the other nations have one, and it's so embarrassing being the only nation in school that doesn't have a king. So God's like, look, it's gonna suck. I'll give you one, but it's gonna suck. And eventually it did. But at first it was kind of awesome because King David. Okay, like I said, flippant as that was, it's more or less true to the biblical account. What's not true to the biblical account, however, is this very cool little piece of reconstructed music that could be close to the kind of music Moses would have heard in his lifetime. So for example, here's this part that's not true, but it's true, okay? So Moses had this really cool uncle that the Bible forgot to mention, his Uncle Jack. And Uncle Jack would come over with his lyre and tell little Moses stories about his days touring with like some of the top artists and how at first he was just a roadie, but then he became a guitar tech. And that was how he was able to get in with Joe Satriani. So Satriani gave him some lessons, right? And it worked out really well for him. So, now Moses would always be like, tell me another story about when you were on tour with Satch. And then play me that song again, the first song he taught you. And Uncle Jack would be like, okay, I've played it so many times for you, but I know you love this song, so here we go. Questions, comments?
It definitely reminds me of the desert temple from Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time.
Nice. Yeah. It kind of reminds me of the thing we just heard from the Hurrian hymn.
Mm-hmm.
It's a different mode. It's clearly not derived from the major scale. Now we're hearing something that I will shortly get into a little bit. But first of all, it's Michael Levy, the guy who worked with Ann Kilmer. So we're dealing with somebody who kind of knows his stuff. Again, that's coming from somebody who would know what the music from this time likely sounded like. Like I said, it's not entirely historically accurate because we don't know for sure, but
close enough.
But close enough. And the story about Uncle Jack was definitely true, even though I said it wasn't.
Hebrew origins according to archaeology.
So, how close does the archaeological record match up with the biblical account? Well, in some places quite well, and in others not well at all. We're not going to compare the archaeological record with the biblical account, because that's not what our show is about. But here's the picture we get from the archaeology. Who they weren't, first of all. They were not the Hyksos, even though some people have suggested that. First of all, it makes literally zero sense. Like, the story about the Hyksos is literally the exact opposite. The Hyksos came in and invaded Egypt and enslaved a portion of the Egyptians, not the other way around. And they were never enslaved themselves by the Egyptians. Most ancient geneticists, I guess you would call them archaeogeneticists, also think that it's a completely different people from the genetic evidence. They were also not the Apiru. Who were the Apiru? Well, ancient records, especially Egyptian ones, complain about these roving bands of bandits that they call the Apiru, which literally means dusty rogue. So these dusty rogues from the desert, these Apiru, were coming in. But look, don't let the name fool you, because even though usually similar sounds are a clue that we have an etymological connection there, but not here. Here, Apiru is just how the word got translated into Egyptian. So the root word, I don't remember which language it was translated from, but it was translated from another language into Egyptian to become Apiru. And the root words for Apiru and Hebrew are actually quite different phonetically. So we just know that that's not them. Their story doesn't line up. If you want to know why it's not the case, we got a video link to that too. So then the earliest mention of Israel comes from this thing called the Merneptah Stele. And this was a 10-foot tall black stone covered in hieroglyphs, discovered in 1896 by Egyptologist Sir Flinders Petrie. And it dates to the reign of the 19th dynasty pharaoh Merneptah, who reigned from 1213 to 1203 BCE. Okay, now the hieroglyphs on this stone, they list like all the accomplishments, right, that the king had. And pretty much like the list of whose asses he kicked and how all these different nations are under him now. And one inscription says, quote, Israel is laid waste, and his seed is not. So it's interesting and maybe a little bit disturbing that the first ever reference to the people group that contained the ancestors of the Jews literally said, Israel is no more, I exterminated them. So it's like, it's so messed up.
Yeah,
like,
very.
You guys cannot catch a freaking break throughout history.
Never.
Literally, the first time anybody mentions you in history, it's like, yeah, we exterminated them.
Mm-hmm. Which time?
Yeah, you're welcome, Hitler. No need to worry. We took care of it. Ugh, God, it's terrible. But anyway, obviously there wasn't the massive cultural baggage that have come with that. He's just thinking, hey, I'm just listening to people that I knocked out. This was one of them.
Mm-hmm.
But here's an interesting thing about this, right? Every other nation, he's using the type of conjugation of nouns, because they did conjugate nouns, in a way that signifies like a land or a territory. But with Israel, it's not about a land or a territory. There, he's using a conjugation that you use when you refer to a specific people group, not a land or a kingdom. So this is why there's some confusion, like maybe they seem to be the Apiru, because that was a people group as well. But when we look at their ancient settlements, they don't have a continuity with the Hebrew stuff. Like we find when we get to the earliest Hebrew settlements, they're extremely different than what we see from the Apiru, the remains of them. That said, there were likely no Jews proper at this point. Whether the 12 tribes concept was a thing yet or not, this was still a mixed Semitic group. And the Jews or their immediate ancestors were just one part of that group. There might be an even older reference to Israel going all the way back to 1300 BC, but it's not really clear. It's just a word scratched onto a rock that looks very much like it could say Israel, but it's surrounded by a bunch of other words that have faded and that we can't read, so we have no idea what the context is. But if it does say Israel, it's the oldest reference.
When we showed up.
Yeah, it originally said, listeners, I wrote when they showed up, but...
When they showed up.
No, you can say when we showed up because,
Mm-hmm.
you're like, one of your great-ass grandfathers was in that group somewhere.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Or, no, I'm sorry, grandmothers. It's matrilineal.
Yeah.
Hey, you're supposed to correct me on that. I know you know that because you've told me that before.
Yep.
Any old way. I'm sure your grandfather was in there, too. Yeah. I mean, obviously, somebody had to be there with your grandmother. It takes two, baby. It takes two. Anyway, so examining the earliest Hebrew settlements can give us some clues as to their origins, though. The earliest definite Hebrew settlements pop up around 1200 BC in the highlands that would come to be known as Canaan. The archaeological record does show this bustling land of Canaanite cities and very active, major part of the Bronze Age trade networks, and it just kind of collapses between like 1400 and 1000 BCE slowly. And this is, just before the time that the earliest Hebrews showed up. So that must have meant the Hebrews did it, right? Well, not so fast. You see, Canaan didn't collapse from violence. Violence may have contributed, but it wasn't the cause. You see, we briefly mentioned in our Neolithic music episode that the Bronze Age collapse was going on. Now, for reasons we still don't fully understand, all the great ancient trade routes started falling apart, and great powers across the region just economically tanked. It was completely tanked. And there are a lot of reasons that are suspected. It was probably, as these things go, a combination of things. We won't go into it here, but basically it involved weather, famine, and a mysterious group of landless invaders known only as the Sea People.
Don't make me do homework or nothing like that. This is the way life was meant to be. Laughing and singing. See people and me. See people and me.
Sorry, wrong Sea People. I hope that makes up for all the times I've been stumbling today.
No, right.
I know this has been
so
hard.
Goofy, dude.
This has been harder than it was supposed to be. But anyway, that's just because some days my eyes are on and some days they're not.
Yep.
Okay, so the Bronze Age collapse is mostly associated with the 12th through 11th centuries BCE, but it started back in the 14th century, and the lands of Canaan were some of the earliest ones to be affected by the collapse. So, when the urban centers all got abandoned, the local pastoral nomads could finally set in. And since they couldn't trade livestock or veggies anymore, they had to figure out ways to make their hilly landscape and mid-quality soil produce those veggies. And eventually they kind of figured out some ways, so they settled in and slowly grew a society. The The punchline here is that the Hebrews came in after Canaan collapsed and ultimately developed a shared heritage around common stories and cultural memories that served to unite a diverse group of peoples into one tribal confederation. And now, again, I'm not saying that the stories were completely made up and people just mindlessly started believing something because somebody told them. Again, like we mentioned earlier, there seems to have been some kind of powerful, galvanizing cultural, social experience that led to this idea that these people were one people. And even though they may have started out as different groups, they certainly are not just those separate groups now. They're becoming this people that occupies this land, and so they needed to understand where they came from. And the reason that we know that something probably happened, and again, I'm not saying it's supernatural, I'm just saying the reason that we know something happened to make the change is that there's like a very abrupt change. Basically, the earliest Israelite settlements were full-on pagan.
Ooh.
Yes. Now, they were probably what you would call henotheistic, meaning they had like one god at the top of the god pile. And this was the god that they called El, also known as El Shaddai, El Hadad, and by other variants. But it was the god that they called El, who, interestingly enough, that name also evolved into Allah for the Muslims. But El was the father of the Ugaritic pantheon. He had a wife named Asherah, and he had a bunch of kids, and he had this enemy called Mot. Basically, this guy was the god of death, and a lot of people would sacrifice their children to him, and El thought that was pretty crappy. So he changed his name to Yahweh, started kicking some butt. Well, basically what actually happens is that it evolves to the point where this principal deity in the pantheon becomes the most important one, to the extent that the other ones are thrown out. And we think that the other ones got thrown out when this idea of something called Yahwism came in. So we don't really know how Yahwism started, but it seems to be a conflation of multiple deities. There was literally a mountain god that was named Jehovah, which is a variant of the name Yahweh. And so this Jehovah figure kind of merged with this El figure. And they started saying, look, this is the one and only God. If you guys are worshiping these other gods, you are a whoring like the other nations after these false idols. And you got to worship one God, the God who made all the other gods. This guy runs the universe, and everybody else who doesn't realize that there's only one God is way off. So monotheism does seem to gradually evolve, and the Hebrews were not the first people to be monotheistic. It's just that they really kind of perfected it. It really became, this is not just a sun god who is the one God, this is the God who's the God. It did take a while to completely clear the pagan influences from the land, and it can be argued that Israel wasn't really 100% monotheistic before the Babylonian captivity, which is why the Yahwist prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah were always losing their minds yelling at the people about selling out to these cheap dime a dozen ancient idols when they've got the actual living God among them. And there's just one of him, and he can really take care of business, so don't mess with him. In fact, if you've got to mess with somebody, go mess with the mountain lion. He's friendlier. You're going to come out a lot better. So, that said, I'm linking to a lecture called The Pagan Origins of Judaism. Obviously, the subject matter is a bit sensitive and controversial, but it's very illuminating to learn, so we're putting it in.
King David.
So however Israel became a cohesive culture and developed its genuinely revolutionary theological views, it was definitely a real nation with real territory by 1000 BC, because King David, my dear Brody, was a real person.
He was. He was king of the Jews.
He was the original, well, after Saul, but he was the real original king of the Jews. Saul kind of sucked, as we'll find out. We know that he was real because there's actually an inscription that has his name on it from the time, and it's obviously no translation. David is a Hebrew name, so we have an inscription, again, kind of like the other Israel inscription. We can't really read too much of the words around it, but the one word that definitely pops out is David.
Yeah, I'm looking at the Hebrew spelling of it, and it's definitely David. Yeah. And David was inscribed on a stone somewhere roughly around 1000 BCE. So there is speculation as to where David's palace was, because it seems like the early Jerusalem was more like just the southeastern corner of Jerusalem today. And that does seem to be where the first temple was located, because we do find some remnants of structure that really matches up with all the descriptions of what the first temple was. Now, as you would know, scripture claims that this temple was decreed by David and finished by Solomon. And here's the thing. David is important to us because he is the father of biblical music tradition for 3 reasons. First of all, he was a great musician king who set national tastes.
Secondly, he likely wrote most of the Psalms, probably some 70% of them. And thirdly, he established the music of the temple. Now, the second two of these are directly relevant to the story of Western classical music, and this is how they start to tie in here. And these are the reasons, in fact, that we consider the music of the ancient Hebrews as one of our parent traditions. But first, let's take a look at the immediate impact he had on his time. So David established the harp as the central instrument of Israelite worship. Just like with our friends, the ancient Egyptians, Sumerians, Indians, and Chinese, the ancient Hebrews also had their central special instrument, and that was the harp. In fact, we get some stories about David playing the harp in the Bible, as you might remember. Do you know any stories about David playing the harp in the Bible?
Nope.
Okay, that's because you don't really... You're just born that way.
Yeah.
One of the most famous stories about King David and his harp playing is from 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 17 through 27. Quote, Saul said to David, "Here is my older daughter Merab. I will give her to you in marriage. Only serve me bravely and fight the battles of the Lord." For Saul said to himself, "I will not raise a hand against him. Let the Philistines do that." But David said to Saul, "Who am I, and what is my family or my clan in Israel that I should become the king's son-in-law?" So, when the time came for Merab, Saul's daughter, to be given to David, she was given in marriage to Adriel of Melohah instead. Now, Saul's daughter Michal was in love with David, and when they told Saul about it, he was pleased. "I will give her to him instead," he thought, "so that she may be a snare to him, and so that the hand of the Philistines might be against him." So Saul said to David, "Now you have a second opportunity to become my son-in-law." Then Saul ordered his attendants, quote, "Speak to David privately and say, 'Look, the king likes you, and his attendants all love you. Now become his son-in-law.'" They repeated these words to David, but David said, "Do you think it is a small matter to become the king's son-in-law? I'm only a poor man, and little known." When Saul's servants told him what David had said, Saul replied, "Say to David, the king wants no other price for the bride than 100 Philistine foreskins to take revenge on his enemies."
Whew.
Saul's plan was to have David fall by the hand of the Philistines. Of course, it said that already. So,
right. The thing you do where you put your thumb through your fingers when you're a little kid, and you're like, "Hey, I got your nose." No, they're like, "I got your foreskin."
Yep.
I got your foreskin. Yeah. Hundreds of them.
Hold on, it gets better. So when the attendants told David these things, he was mightily pleased to become the king's son-in-law. So before the allotted time elapsed, David took his men with him and went out and killed 200 Philistines and brought back their foreskins. They counted them out. They counted out the full number to the king so that David might become the king's son-in-law. Then Saul gave him his daughter Michal in marriage. Oh, whoops, that's the wrong story. Sorry. But you never knew that was in the good book, did you?
Mm-mm.
So, yeah. Can you just imagine the accountant that day? Like when he drops it? 42, 43.
I didn't sign up for this.
No.
I'm a numbers guy.
I'm a numbers guy, but there's certain things I like to count. I like to count money.
Yeah, and that's why I don't buy lunch meat from Moyles anymore. It's just too damn chewy.
Oh, no. That explains it.
Yep.
I always wondered what that was about. Well, look, I would just love to see the look on the accountant's face when he had to count it, though.
Yeah.
"I see your 100 foreskins, and I raise you 100 more. I figured there's no other time in this series where I would get to tell that story. And it's hilarious because not too many people know about David and the bag of dick.
Right, yeah. Better make sure you bleep that one out so no one can possibly guess what you said.
What's wrong with the word deck?
Yeah, decks.
I thought it would help us appeal to the general contractor crowd if I told this story, you know.
Yeah, they cut the railings off all the decks.
That's what they did. Yep, that was the foreskin, you know. They kind of shaved like the top layer of wood.
Mm-hmm. Just sand it down a bit.
Yep, that's all. Yeah, so it's a lot less horrifying than you think it is.
No, that's somehow worse.
Yeah, we're giving you decks.
Sand it down.
Oh no, just the decks.
Just the decks.
We're talking about real decks now. But hey, that's not what we're meant to be talking about, is it? This is a music show, for God's sake. And look, the world is full of enough problems. We don't need to be inciting any more envy among people because their deck isn't as big as their neighbors.
Mm-hmm.
So let's try this again. There's another story from 1 Samuel. I think this one might actually do it. So let's say 1 Samuel chapter 16, verses 14 through 23. Quote, "Now the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him. Saul's attendants said to him, 'See, an evil spirit from God is tormenting you. Let our Lord command his servants here to search for someone who can play the lyre. He will play when the evil spirit from God comes upon you, and you will feel better.' So Saul said to his attendants, 'Find someone who plays well, and bring him to me.' One of the servants answered, 'I have seen one of Jesse at Bethlehem who knows how to play the lyre. He is a brave man and a warrior. He speaks well and will be a fine-looking man,' in case you wanted that too. 'And the Lord is with him.' Then Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, 'Send me your son David, who is with the sheep.' So Jesse took a donkey and loaded it with bread, a skin of wine, and a young goat, because you should be bringing presents to the king even if you don't have much. David came to Saul and entered his service. Saul liked him very much, and David became one of his armor bearers. Then Saul sent word to Jesse, saying, 'Allow David to remain in my service, for I am pleased with him.' Thus, whenever the Spirit from God was upon Saul, David would take up his lyre and play. Then relief would come to Saul. He would feel better, and the evil spirit would leave him." And that is the first reason why David was so awesome. So not only is he the center of ancient Israelite music and the start of it all, as we understand it, but he's also one of the world's earliest mentioned music therapists, if you think about it.
Yeah.
Saul would get whatever this thing was that was happening to him. Like, he'd get into this foul mood, and back then, everything was an evil spirit, whether it actually was or not. He would get into this real bad state, and David would come and play for him, and it would just calm him down.
Oh, that's very sweet of him.
Yeah, I'm sure he wasn't being paid, but that's okay because he's now in the king's entourage. And as you know, that eventually led to him going and getting the Philistine foreskins and becoming the king's son-in-law.
Yeah.
And that's how he wound his way up to being king.
Ooh.
Yeah. The other reason that he was so awesome was because he was a genuine hit with the ladies.
I'll bet.
Yeah, apparently the guy was pretty hot. That seems to be the general consensus. And there are other stories in Samuel about David coming home from battle and women coming out into the streets with like timbrels and shakers and all kinds of instruments and singing songs about all the dudes that David just killed, Because in those days that was like, yeah, hey, they're foreign. They're the bad guys. We killed them. He killed them. And he's hot.
Yeah, I kind of like to envision him looking like the guy who plays Aquaman. Yeah.
Yeah.
I can never remember his name.
Yeah.
But gigantic, handsome man.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I don't know how big David was, but if we were ever going to do a movie about David, we would cast him.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No.
Okay. So, all right, cool. Nice thing is we can hear an example of the type of harp that David would likely have played. And I'm not going to describe it because that's what Brody's going to do. I'll play it for you first, and then you can just tell me after we hear it. Okay. So this is also Michael Levy.
Well, it's definitely a lyre because of the shape and form of it. It's got quite a few more strings than small lyres of that size that I've seen before. I like the little sound holes on the side that look like little flowers as well.
Yeah, make it a little bit more resonant.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, it's like F holes on a violin, for example.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. And you made a good point. I don't think we've made a very clear distinction yet between the harp and the lyre in this series. The ancient Greeks are one of the first people, I think, if not the first, to actually spell out what the distinction is. But it has to do with the sound box. The lyre tends to have like a larger sounding board, whereas the harp is just like it's this bow with strings across it. The lyre is the one that has like the big soundboard.
Yeah.
That's more or less the difference. There's other differences, but that's kind of the key one.
Yeah, if you call that a harp, I say lyre.
That's awesome. So point number 2 was the Psalms, right? So we just did point number 1, that he was this awesome musician who did all these cool things in his lifetime. But point number 2 is the Psalms. David wrote most of them. There are roughly 150 Psalms, and they are the most regularly performed body of sacred music in the entire Western world. So look, Western classical music would not exist as it does now without the Psalms, because we are going to hear them used in everything from the earliest Gregorian chants that we will be looking at, all the way up to the chorale settings of J.S. Bach, and well beyond, all the way up to contemporary masters like Arvo Pärt and Sir John Tavener. They're going to be with us a lot. They're one of the primary scriptural inspirations, especially from the Old Testament, and it's just, without the Psalms, we wouldn't really have so much of the music that we have come to adore in our tradition. We will spend plenty of time discussing the Psalms in our main series, so we're not really going to dive into them here. Just know that we'll have plenty of opportunities to talk all kinds of talk about the Psalms. Meantime, David's third contribution was the creation of the Hebraic chant tradition on the whole. Realistically, Hebrew chant existed long before David, and who knows what it sounded like, how it evolved down through the thousands of years, but David was the one who enshrined it into the official temple practices. So when the temple was being created, first thing he did was he blessed the Levites. This is the priestly caste that descended from Moses' brother Aaron, to whom God gave the priesthood because he had this grandson Phineas, who did some really awesome things with slaying foreigners and driving them out of the Israelite camp. God was impressed with that, so he gave Phineas the eternal covenants of the priesthood, and the priests were, of course, in charge of the music. Yeah, with the right to officiate temple ceremonies with music. That's what the Levites got. Now, David created 24 rotating choirs of priests to sing for specific lengths of the year, and also explicitly required the use of instruments. Now, this is interesting because I know you're not a practicing Jew, but if you were practicing, you would realize that if you go to a synagogue or temple today, there's no instruments. It's just all vocal.
Yeah.
That was the thing that came in with the rabbis. They wanted to do something different. But yeah, in the earliest days, there would have been instruments and voices. We are not going to listen to any ancient Hebrew instruments for the most part, because that's not what we're trying to do here. We do need to talk about the tradition a little bit, but mostly we're focusing on how it impacts Western classical music. So we're not going to do the kind of deep dive that we did from ancient Sumer and Egypt or any of that. But we do need to mention, we should probably mention that the most famous instrument associated with the ancient Israelites is the shofar.
Yeah.
I know you know what that is. Yep. Yep. In case somebody out there has like literally just woken up after a 10,000 year coma, or maybe a 4,000 year coma or something, a shofar is a curved bone horn that comes from a ram's horn, typically, although they can be made out of wood and metal, that you've all heard many, many, many times, even if you somehow don't think you know it.
Yeah, it sounds kind of like Adam Sandler in The Waterboy.
Yeah, it's a pretty raw sound. But look, you know, it's important that we blow the trumpet in the new moon. So we do that, or you do that. I know you don't, but like you're supposed to be, and I don't know what you're doing not doing that. But hey. But look, here is a sound of a shofar being blown out in front of the gates of Jerusalem on a random morning. But wait, that's not the sound we all know and love. Let's get a nice, modern, ultra, like, not realistic shofar. It's kind of, I don't know, is this metal or bone or what? Can you tell me real quick?
Usually made of bone. Let me check this. Oh, yeah, it's bone.
That's fine. Okay.
Yeah, it's made out of a ram horn, gigantic ram horn.
Okay. All right. So this is the sound that you're probably more familiar with the shofar.
Yeah, that wasn't ominous or foreboding at all.
Well, it's funny because it's supposed to be the call to worship, but it also was associated with going to war. You're calling on the Spirit of God, one way or the other, to hear the prayers, accept the prayers, and also to come to the aid of Israel when she's in the face of her enemies.
Time to get some foreskins.
Yeah, that's right. This is the call of the foreskin hunters. And yeah, I needed to hear that fifth, so I played that second version. So look, what matters to us, though, is the chanting. We've actually got a pretty good idea of how it would have happened because there was this awesome musicologist named Suzanne Hake Ventura. And what Suzanne Hake Ventura figured out was if you look at the Psalms, they have these weird little markings next to them that kind of nobody ever really knew what they were. They figured that they were maybe means of helping to pronounce the words better. But she made the argument that no, in fact, these are what she called cantillation marks, which were essentially markings to let you know which notes you were supposed to be singing.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know the details of how she figured out how to associate these with specific notes, but she was able to determine that there was a specific scale that seems to be used over and over again in the Bible. And because of her, we now know the scale that was likely used as, again, the master scale for the ancient Hebrew chanting. The only example I was able to find on YouTube of somebody just playing the scale by itself are these two Messianic Jews. So, they might have a little bit of a context that they're presenting it in, obviously in a religious context, but I'm going to show it to you so that you can hear what the scale sounds like. Again, actually, no, this is not the Lyre of David. This is like a more modern style harp, but, well, it actually looks a lot like a Celtic harp. It's got that kind of curved top that you think of when you think of a harp normally. But I believe it's got gut strings. So at any rate, here's these two very, just come here. I would just see this guy's face. So you can see when I first saw this, I was like, oh God, what are we in for?
Nah, he's so happy.
He's like, hello!
Yeah, he's super psyched.
He's just so happy to be telling you about this. We know the music that King David played. God is good. Check this out.
Hello, everybody. I am so excited. I'm here with Michael David. Him and his wife support Messianic Jews. They're doing incredible things around the world related to the restoration of the harp. Now, you're going to play something for us right now that's really unique because it's actually the notes that are found in Scripture. He's got the harp right here. They're actually the notes that are found in Scripture. And this is what it would have sounded like back then. They would have been playing harps, and it would have sounded like
That's
this.
correct. And in the Tanakh, from Genesis all the way to Malachi, there are Hebrew characters that are the consonants, and that's how Hebrew works.
Okay.
And there are little dots that indicate the vowels, so you know what the vowel sound you should be saying. But then, in addition to that, and when my wife was in Hebrew school, she saw these little extra markings. They weren't the vowel pointings. And she came to her teacher and she said, "What are these marks? How are you supposed to interpret those?" And they're called cantillation pointing or trope. And these markings have been there all along in plain sight. And the rabbis who sing, who are called cantors, they specifically say, well, these are more like punctuation marks. But awful lot of punctuation marks to try to explain.
It doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make sense. And so there was a musicologist named Suzanne Hake Ventura who made it her life work to study this out and say, no, these could perhaps be real notes.
Wow.
And she discovered what the scale was, and it sounds like this. Doesn't that sound Hebraic?
Sounds pretty Hebrew to me.
It is, and on all that Hebraic sound, it sort of comes from that Middle Eastern tonal scales.
That's all we need to hear from that. But yeah, that's the scale.
Man, I wish they had asked me that back when I went to Hebrew school because that was kind of common knowledge at my school.
Really?
Yeah, about the cantor marks. Yeah, they're like it's in the Torah. Like whenever you read the Torah, you basically sing the Torah, and there are those cantation marks all over it, and it's basically to let you know whether to go up or down.
I'm so glad they taught you that, dude. That's awesome.
Yeah.
That makes me really happy because, like he was saying, a lot of cantors for the longest time just thought there were punctuation marks, but why so many? Why does every word seem to have a punctuation mark? It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, it's to let you know whether to go up or down or keep the note the same.
Yep. That is one of the ways in which ancient Hebrew chant connects to Gregorian chant, because when we finally get to Gregorian chant, the earliest Gregorian chant notation, it's basically that, with just little dots and squiggles above words to tell you what to go up or go down or how long to hold it.
Yep. Temple music.
So Hayek Ventura has gone about reconstructing ancient Hebrew music the way that Ann Kilmer did with ancient Sumerian. She didn't just stop with that scale. She started looking into how did the chant actually work using that scale and modes of that scale. So she actually made an album of what music in Solomon's temple may very well have sounded like. And again, we're dealing with one of the world's foremost experts, so this is probably pretty spot. So, would you like to hear some of the psalms your ancestors may have chanted with possibly the real original melodies?
No.
Okay. All right, fine.
No,
I do. All right, we'll just skip to ancient Greece.
I do.
As we've talked about in past episodes, Brody is very expert at entertaining himself.
Yeah.
And don't say it, because I know what you're thinking. Anyway, moving on. Let's start with Psalm 19. So I'm going to play you the original 3,000-year-old melody of Psalm 19. Revealed? Maybe. All right, here we go. I should ask you, does that sound familiar?
Yes, it does.
Aside from just, I'm sure you chanted something or sang things like that in Hebrew school.
Mm-hmm.
It should also sound very similar to something else that you may be familiar with, because this music is the direct ancestor of Gregorian chant. We can and will trace a line from that chanting straight to Gregorian chant, which is the beginning of Western classical music.
Awesome.
Yeah. It's going to take about 1,800 years to get there, but from that starting point, that music is going to work its way to become the Gregorian chant.
Cool.
So we are truly hovering close now to the beginning of our story proper. I want to show you just one more because the most famous psalm out there is Psalm 23. And this is just a little rendition of Psalm 23 verses 1 through 6. Yeah, just to kind of get a little bit more of that sound into our head. Hey there, listeners. Just a quick explanation of the bit of conversation you're about to hear. Earlier in the recording session, Brody and I were discussing the possibility that King David also sang for King Saul, and perhaps even sang some of his psalms. Now, as far as I can tell, there's absolutely no evidence for this, scriptural or otherwise. But considering that the man was universally recognized by his people as a phenomenal musician, and as a great songwriter, a great poet, and a great singer, it's really not too much of a logical leap to assume that he sang for King Saul, and perhaps even sang some of his psalms for the king, maybe when they were brand new compositions. In any event, I decided to cut that part out to keep things focused, but because we recorded this episode over a month ago, I forgot that we actually do swing back around to it later. So that's what this next bit is all about. Anyway, back to Ronnie and Brody of the past. What do you think of that?
Like it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very soothing.
You remember King David would sing these melodies to soothe King Saul. Mm-hmm. And you could kind of imagine him singing something like that.
Yeah.
You know? And Saul just being like, yeah, right. The Lord is my shepherd. Of course he is. All right. I can do this. I can get through this.
Yeah. The trick is to sing it in a room that has so much reverb that it could almost be considered echo.
Like a big throne room, for example. Yep.
Yeah. Very reflective room.
Yeah. It's almost like if you hear Gregorian chant or any like ancient Hebrew chant without the echo, it still sounds cool, but
it doesn't sound right.
It doesn't quite sound right.
No, it doesn't hit right.
It's meant to be performed, or maybe not even performed, but it's meant to be chanted in like a
massive hall.
A resonant space.
Yeah.
The reverb is part of its character.
Mm-hmm. The end of the beginning.
Now, the northern kingdom fell because a king called Jeroboam didn't want to follow God's laws anymore. So he split up the kingdom. And sometimes this is called Jeroboam's breach. Well, God showed Jeroboam's descendants a thing or more about how he felt. And he did that by allowing the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser III and his buddies to come and scatter them to the four winds from 733 to 732 BCE. The southern kingdom got their comeuppance about a century and a half later when Nebuchadnezzar brought the entire kingdom of Judah into captivity in Babylon. Now, the scribes of the time made the best of a bad situation by writing the Bible, figuring since it was going to be such a big hit for the next 2,500 years, they may as well go ahead and create it. Next up, Cyrus the Great comes along, breaks a whole bunch of Assyrian skulls, and lets the Jews go back home to Israel, where they build a second temple. And for a while, it worked out really great. Until, okay, yeah, that's important. I did want to say that the guys who wrote the Bible, it did have musical implications because these new thinkers, these new scribal thinkers, who were later called Pharisees, would become the Talmudic rabbis after the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans in 70 CE. But before any of that happened, Alexander the Great blew through the region and took it over. His descendants kept trying to make everyone do Greek things, and when they kept being Jewish, Antiochus IV made that illegal and banned all Jewish religious practices. Sound familiar?
Mm-hmm.
It just never freaking stops.
A tale as old as time.
A tale as old as time.
Yeah, you know what you never really hear too often anymore? Run, the Jews are coming.
You heard it once, though.
Yeah, once. A long time ago.
Yeah. So this ultimately led to a very angry man named Judah the Maccabee, dragging a Seleucid official into the temple and stabbing him to death on the altar of the Lord. So take that, Seleucids. Then they rededicated the temple, told Antiochus to suck it, and stop them if he can. He couldn't. He lost. Hanukkah, the end. Hello again, listeners. Future Ronnie here, just swooping in to set up the intermission. Before I do that, however, I would like to apologize for our extremely scant and wildly oversimplified coverage of the first millennium BCE in Israelite history. It may seem like I dropped a bunch of people and place names without giving any proper introduction, but similar to the situation with King David earlier, we had already discussed these people and places. In fact, we had just finished discussing these people and places for 40 minutes. Then, when I realized how much extra editing that was going to be, Brody suggested that I just replace it with a quick summary to save myself the headache later. So that's what I did, more or less on the fly. Plus, we've still got the ancient Greeks to cover, and there's going to be a lot more to say about them. I doubt this will be an issue for most of our current listeners, since I think at this stage the majority of you are finding us through other history podcasts. But for those of you who join later and are coming from a classical music background without a whole lot of knowledge of history, well, you can either look up any names or places that seem interesting to you, or just dive into some podcasts that cover the period. We've already told you a couple good ones. Before moving on from Israel, however, there is one more point I'd like to make about ancient Hebrew chant. It's a point that I originally saved for the next episode, but it really should be included here as well because it's one of the key reasons that we say that ancient Hebrew chant is the direct ancestor of Gregorian chant. It's not just the unmetered free-flowing lines of text or the ethereal-sounding melodies that support them. It's also not the psalms that were chanted because they are their own contribution, but it is the way the psalms were chanted. Just a quick explanation, we go into it a bit more next time, but it's two things: psalm tones and chanting style. Psalm tones are formulae that are meant to get you from the start of a chant to a specific tone that the rest of the chant orbits around, and it's like the main tone of the chant, and then there's a closing formula. Now, there is no evidence for a formalized system of psalm tones in use during King David's time, but if Susan Van Heek's interpretations of the psalm melodies are correct, then we do find within those melodies the structural precursors to the psalm tones, and that's a big deal. The other big deal was the style, or perhaps we might say more accurately, the forms in which the chant was recited. Hebrew chant introduced two forms that are absolutely at the heart and soul of all Orthodox Christian liturgy, even down to this day. And these are the responsory and the antiphon. Both of these are types of call and response singing. The difference being that with a responsory you have a soloist who is answered by the rest of the choir, whereas with an antiphon, you divide the choir up in half, and you have one half doing the call and the other half doing the respond. Again, as with so many of these things, these styles of chanting probably well predated ancient Israel. However, the ancient Israelites are the earliest culture we know to make them fundamental to their religious services, and this would carry on and later transmit directly into the religious services of the Jews proper and of all of Orthodox Christianity. And that is why ancient Israelite music is one of our parent strains. Okay, so this is usually the point where I would drop in a piece of Western classical music to serve as the intermezzo, but since we just don't have time for that today, I'm instead going to link to a piece by another phenomenal Jewish musician that has been stuck in my head for these past couple of days, and that is the Variations Concertantes, opus number 17 by Felix Mendelssohn. I trust that you will all check it out, fall in love with it, and add it to at least one of your playlists. I don't know which one, just go with the vibe. And in the meantime, please enjoy our rude and uncultured transition to the civilized and highly cultured Greeks.
The ancient Greeks.
Okay, so look, my original goal with the ancient Greeks was to deal with just the contributions that they made to Western classical music, because there's a lot to talk about. But then as I started really diving into the Greeks again for the first time in a long time, I came to realize that literally everything they did touches on Western classical music.
Yeah.
Right down to inventing music theater for all intents and purposes. And that being an ancestor to opera. But lest we get ahead of ourselves, it's just that they cover absolutely everything. Because even though it seems like all cultures in the ancient world placed a pretty high premium on music, man, the ancient Greeks just really were into music. It's just absolutely everywhere. You get the sense that it was almost as ubiquitous in society as it is today. It's just the music would have been, well, usually quieter. But anywhere you went, you were going to hear music if you were in a bustling city. So probably in that sense, maybe the closest it is to the kind of exposure we have to music today that you could really find anywhere in the ancient world. And that's because the Greeks were super musical. And look, all this should surprise absolutely no one, because ancient Greece not only gives us our musical culture, it gives us pretty much our culture. Everything that comes before, like even leading up to the scientific revolution, all Western philosophy, all Western art, everything that we have, pretty much it's all Greek. It's all Greek to us. So we are going to run through all of our usual categories of mythology and instruments and theory. And we're also going to take a look at music drama and something very important at the end. But we're not going to do the deep dive like we did with everything else. We're just going to talk about how each of these areas impacted and in some ways even led directly to our classical music.
Alrighty. Terminology.
So the first thing we get from the ancient Greeks that's connected to music is, well, the word music. The word music itself, it derives from the word muses, who were the 3 daughters of Zeus, who were the patron goddesses of all creative and intellectual endeavors. Also, we get the concept of modes, not just the concept of the modes, but the names of the modes. Dorian and Phrygian and Lydian, well, these were named after places in Greece. Doria, Phrygia, and Lydia.
Oh, okay.
And now people often misunderstand this. They think, oh, well, it's supposed to be that those modes were themselves associated with the place. No, it was that the modes had a certain characteristic, a vibe, that people thought kind of matched with the vibe of people in specific areas.
Okay.
So like Dorians had a certain kind of vibe. I don't want to say spicy, but a little bit hot-tempered and so on. And so they created the Dorian mode, which is our Phrygian mode. So when you think of that, you would know it if I played it for you. It's the mode of the major scale that sounds like vaguely Arabic.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Dorian is the mode of the major scale that people often think of when they think of medieval music.
Gotcha.
Also, they allowed for additional microtones within the modes. And it seems, again, there's some evidence that they may have picked that up from Egypt, but then it's like, well, where did Egypt get that? And then if we trace it all the way back, could it be that Hijaz Makam or something like that came from even earlier Sumeria or someplace around there to Egypt? We'll just never know with that. So concept of modes and their names. Also, I can tell you at least 2 words. The word orchestra. The word orchestra at the time actually referred to the seats, the semicircular seating around the stage. Later on, in the early Baroque period, it came to designate a pit, the pit where the musicians sit. The musicians sit in the orchestra, which is the place the musicians sit. And then over time, it becomes so associated with the musicians who sit there that the word orchestra comes to refer to the musicians themselves.
Okay.
So you can thank
that makes sense.
And you can thank opera for the coming into being of the orchestra, and you can thank the ancient Greeks for the ancestry of opera.
Awesome. So thank you.
So both the word and this, if you want to call it the genre, go back. In fact, we can say the genre because, as you'll discover, there are so many genres within classical music.
Yes.
It's just a super genre that covers a lot. Also, the word tympanum, and yeah, that's for drum. So we just still use the Greek word for this type of drum. At just straight up, we just have that in its original meaning. So we're not going to go too deeply into the ancestry or the cultural history of ancient Greece, just enough to tell the story that we need to tell. If you really want to dig into that stuff, I can't recommend enough the Hellenistic World podcast. If you want to know a little bit more about the Alexandrian period, well, obviously the Alexander Standard. And then if you want to know more about the later Greek period that we will very briefly touch on our final background episode, check out The History of Byzantium with Robin Pearson, and check out the 2nd season of Totalis Rankium. There we go. Got all the shout outs in for the session. But they're good. They all provide exceptional coverage of this period.
Minoan music.
So there are 2 people groups that ultimately become the Greeks as we know them today. These are the Minoans and the Mycenaeans. Now, they were 2 very different cultures. The Mycenaeans were basically the occupants of the mainland in Bronze Age Greece. The Minoans lived on a little island called Crete. It seemed like their culture kind of extended beyond that island, but mostly it was really tightly connected to that. And this island, it was very different than what we would associate with the later Greek culture. Most of what Greeks were interested in was being dudes. They just really loved being dudes, and everything that they could think about that was dudely, they were into. They were very masculine-centered. The Minoans, on the other hand, seemed to be quite a bit more balanced, you could say. They were comfortable enough to have plenty of depictions of women dancing topless because it just seemed like they didn't really think much of that. Now, there's a famous story of the labyrinth with the bull. It's like being trapped in the labyrinth and all this. The bull in the labyrinth concept goes back to the Minoans. And the Minoans provide some of the earliest evidence of music that we have for the ancient Greeks, or I should say the ancestors of the ancient Greeks. And one of these is the Minoan lyre. And I know we've been listening to a whole lot of lyres this episode, and we're going to hear one more. But it sounds, I think, a little different than the other ones that we've heard. I will describe it for you rather than have you go ahead, just for the sake of efficiency here. It's a swan neck lyre, and it is very much used for improvisation. Why don't you pop on over here and I'll show it to you. Kind of looks a bit like David's lyre, but let's hear what it sounds like. The one thing I want to ask you is, did you notice a difference in the sound between that and the other ones that we listened to last time?
Yeah.
What did you hear different?
The sound was very clear coming from
Yep.
it. There weren't a whole lot of overtones with the strings. You can definitely see that that's more for melody lines.
Mm-hmm.
Like a solo piece there.
Yeah, and even like the Lyre of David and the one that was used for the Hurrian hymn, you hear a lot of string slappiness, like this, which is kind of nice. It makes it sound very
fills it in a lot.
It fills it in a lot. But this is just very much, it's like just very much about that pure tone. And I think that should give us a little bit of insight into how the Greeks thought about their music. They really wanted to define it. They wanted things that were more definite, more clear. And so that's how they're coming at it.
Minoan dance.
So dancing was obviously a very big thing in a culture like this. We see so many reliefs in the palace on Knossos, which is the capital. It was a very big thing, and there have been people who have actually reconstructed the dancing based on what they see in the pictures, because there's so much detail in the iconography that literally without any written records and just a couple of references in later texts, we can pretty much get a good idea of how they danced. And listeners, I'm not going to play this clip for you because the music is modern, but I'm going to show it to Brody because even though the music is modern, the dancing is accurate to the ancient Minoans. We will put a link to it though, so you guys can actually watch the video on your own time. This video is called Minoan Theater, the Minoan Experience.
That looked fun.
Could you describe what you saw?
It's a bunch of people dancing around. There was a group of men and a group of women dancing, and in the beginning they were separated, and they were kind of showing, I guess it would be their gender roles in their society. The men were posturing like strong, like warriors, and the women were dancing a lot more feminine, with
delicate,
dancing with balls of yarn, you know. At least that's parts that I saw. And then they got to the bull leaping, where they were all just jumping around a big stuffed bull, and that looked fun.
Yeah, that looked like a lot of fun.
Yeah.
So apparently, now this is what the professional dancers did there, and we see a lot of depictions in the iconography of people leaping over bulls. So we don't really know if that was just a specialist group of people, but there's some thought that people just gradually learned how to dance like that, and part of the idea was they wanted to show, like you said, like that warrior strength. And even though they were a much more egalitarian society than pretty much anyone that we've looked at before or that we will look at again until we more or less arrive at the modern world, they still obviously had clearly defined gender roles. It's just that they didn't think one was better than the other, or one should always rule and the other one shouldn't, or one needed to dominate the other.
Yeah.
They really seemed to not have that. The Mycenaeans, on the other hand, who were on the mainland, that was more their gig. They were kind of more on board with everybody else in that. But as they say, every Greek loves his mother. So they still managed to kind of hold some modicum of respect just by that. I mean, a modicum. All right, but let me tell you, part of the reason, and you don't need, well, you actually should come here because I want you to see the lyrics to this. It's probably the only way you'll really understand, unfortunately, what this person is saying. It is an English translation of the Minoan original, But part of the reason that we know so much about ancient Crete is because we actually have a song that, it's so funny, it's almost stereotypical, just the language that's used here, but it's everything that we pretty much think of when we think of Crete is pretty much right here in this song.
Spending my days in dolphin frescoes, boldly being naked in the palace of my nose, and he has a labyrinth, man-eating bowl. Say it's a death maze. Don't get trapped in a death maze. And I'm from Greece. I'm in over famous Talosocracy from 2000 BC. Said no souls, as columns of red.
I got you again.
That was very clever. I like that.
It's like just borderline cringe.
Yeah, almost.
Almost.
It's too clever to be cringe, though.
It's too clever. You kind of got a little bit of that Mazzy Star kind of vibe from the vocals. Sadly enough, the word Cretan that we get today when you say somebody's so stupid you call them a Cretan, well, that was because the later Greeks thought that folks on Crete were pretty stupid. Partly because they had such an egalitarian system and they were all like wild and lascivious, and that's why they were destroyed by the gods. And they were actually, maybe not by the gods, but certainly by a very violent volcano called Santorini.
Yes.
I don't practice Santorini, but I know about the volcano.
That was stupid.
Hey, look, I'm
so stupid.
It's no stupider than what we just listened to. Maybe that's the sequel. How do you know that it's not?
Right.
Whoopsie. Speaking of dummies, I meant to say the volcano Thera on the island of Santorini. In my defense, however, Santorini was the ancient name for the volcano Thera, and I definitely knew that, and that's clearly why I made the slip up. Well, I gotta play this clip now, though, because remember, I did that to you once with Egypt. So I think you might know this clip.
There's an old saying in Tennessee, I know it's in Texas, probably in Tennessee, that says, fool me once, shame on you. If fool me, we can't get fooled again.
I love it, dude. Every time I've heard that, it gets funnier and funnier.
It ages like a good wine.
Ah, beautiful. And that's our political humor, everybody.
Yeah, and hey, that's about as political as we're ever going to get.
Yeah. Mycenaean music.
Okay, now the Mycenaeans, I am not going to dive too much into their music other than to say that these people were, again, the more direct cultural antecedent to the ancient Greeks as we know them. They brought in all the gods, all the big name gods, including Zeus, and we are going to listen to what would be in the style of a very early hymn to Zeus right now. I should let you know that the instrument being played is the psaltery and that the performer is using metal strings, which is certainly not appropriate to the time. If this performance is ballparking it at, let's say, the late Mycenaean period, we're looking at 1100 to 1000 BCE. Yeah, they're using gut strings. This is also not a scholar performer playing this piece, so I can't really vouch for the authenticity of the language. It may represent a later form of Greek than what was spoken at this time. In fact, I'm just about certain of that, so the whole thing might be off. But good news is, this is the only piece in the entire Greek set that we have to listen to just for vibes. And keep our fingers crossed that just maybe there's a whiff of truth in here.
Όζευ πάτερ Ζευ. Σον μεν ουρανού κράτος. Σι δερ επανθρώπων οράς. Λεωργά και θεμιστά. Σι δε θηρίων, ύβριστε και δίκη μέλη.
Sounds like a soundtrack to a dream when it's not quite a dream, not quite a nightmare, but somewhere in between.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I liked the sound of the instrument. I like particularly if you listen closely, you can hear it's always got this oscillation in the background. So,
yeah.
It's just the way that the overtones are resonating with each other sympathetically. It's like one gets louder while the other gets softer, and then vice versa. And listeners, if you go back and play it again, listen in the moments when no strings are being plucked and it's just resonating, and see if you can hear the whoa, whoa, whoa in it, because it's there. Now, this is an example of a type of hymn where the text would have been recited with that kind of rhetorical flourish that we just heard there, and it was spoken. But obviously, we know that there were many hymns that were sung as well. Here's an example of what just such an ancient hymn may have sounded like. This piece is what is known in scholastic circles as a double dipper. That is to say, it praises two supernatural beings in one song. In this case, Caliope, or Caliope, the daughter of Zeus, and the god Apollo himself. I should say, it sounds like it could be a little bit contemporary, but at the same time, it's more a vamp than a chord progression, although it might kind of sound a little like a chord progression, which would be anachronistic. But I think it's as reasonable as not, at least the first part of the performance, which we will hear right now. So the one thing I will say is that this is probably not fully authentic because, as you will notice, the artist, I believe his name is Thomas Cleopas, he's actually going to break into more or less a chord progression. And we know that that would have been anachronistic because nobody had figured out the circle of fifths as far as we know. We're going to discover how that was discovered as we go along, but it pretty much was not terribly likely to be around at this time. That said, the ancients are always surprising us as we discover new things. It's not too hard to imagine that since we know that the ancients had the major scale, and that almost everybody in the world seems to have had the major scale, that it might not be too hard to think about just implications of root motion within that scale and focusing on different notes. But they wouldn't have thought of it as specific harmonies per se, or combinations of melodies or anything like that just yet. So I feel like, long story short, I think there might be some modern influence in this, but there's something that also kind of feels like there's something that rings true in it as well. And I don't know if it's just the ancient language or what, but also, listeners, if you check out the video, you'll notice that the lyre that this guy is playing is actually very much like what we would consider a kithara. It's starting to get a sound box that looks a lot like a proto-lute. It's got like that rounded body with the rounded soundboard and the long strings as a harp.
Music in mythology.
Again, we're not going to stay too long in this topic because, incidentally, we're going to have a lot of opportunities to talk about this when we get to the Renaissance and the Baroque period, because Greek mythology is all up and through those time periods. It's exactly what everybody was about, and it was like all about recreating what was perceived to be the lost perfect music of the ancient Greeks, because our music today isn't cutting it. Apparently, it did a lot better in those days. But I will tell you two specific examples from the mythology, aside from the fact that Zeus's daughters were all literally the reason that we have the word music. The biggest one, and I think you guys, if you know your classics, you know what I'm about to say, is Orpheus. The tale of Orpheus is, you're going to talk about the original emo. Well, maybe not the original, but it's also got that vibe, because Orpheus was the god of love and music, and he played this really wicked, sick lyre. They didn't say it that way, but that was what he did. And he was just so awesome and had such a beautiful voice that he charmed all the nymphs. Everybody wanted this guy, but he was in love with the nymph Eurydice. He marries her, and it's this beautiful wedding, and everything is going great, but lo and behold, there's a snake in the grass, and it bites her heel. She dies and goes down to the underworld. But this is absolutely unjust. This cannot happen. This is not allowed to happen. The universe must get out of the way and let love win, for the god's sake. And so Orpheus finds a way to get into the underworld, and he's basically going to go, and his plan is to play such a sweet music before Hades himself that he'll have to release Eurydice. And so he goes down and he plays this music, and we get the sense that Hades isn't really terribly moved, but everybody else around him is, and they kind of persuade him, but he realizes he can't be weak either. He can't just let a soul out of the underworld. So he says, listen, I'll let you take her back up, but it's a long way up, and you cannot look back even once, or she's mine. And of course, you know how this is going to go. It's a long travel, and just eats at him, and finally he turns back and looks, and he sees that she's there, and just as soon as he breathes a sigh of relief, she disappears. Probably cursing him the whole way down, but it's a very sad story. He never gets her back. It's a loss that he suffers and he endures. So he is like the tragic hero. He's the great god of music, but forever brokenhearted. So again, we're going to see that. The very earliest operatic masterpiece is about this story. And it's a masterpiece. I cannot wait till we talk about it. Also, there is a story about the god Apollo having a music competition with a satyr. The satyrs are the horny goats that dance around with the panpipes.
Oh, yes.
And the reason I say the horny goats is because they have horns. And as a matter of fact, it is speculated that the reason that we have the word horny today, not to be too graphic, and I hope this isn't pushing us past the clean rating, is that the satyrs were basically goat-headed male nymphs. And they were very randy all the time, and they had horns. So when somebody says that they are horny, what they're saying is, I am feeling like a satyr.
That makes a lot of sense.
And naturally, they associate the getting down, as it were, with the getting down, as it were, as in one form and then the musical form. Obviously, all the satyrs were musicians. Big surprise there. So one of these was called Marsyas, and he gets into a musical competition with Apollo, and they make a bet, and basically whoever wins can do whatever they want to the other one. Apollo wins, obviously, and he has Marsyas flayed alive, because that's what you do in the ancient world. You can't just be like, all right, handshake, that was cool. No, I'm going to flay you alive. I hope that they had the good decency to eat him afterwards.
Right.
Like your Sumerian guy did with the goat that they sacrificed, you know.
Yeah, waste not, want not,
waste
baby.
Not, want not. You know, it's like you offer the spirit of it to the god.
Yeah, they get the spirit, but I'm eating this goat.
Right, plus you can drop like a slice of the meat through your, I think it was a shem. Yeah, through your shem that we had, remember? And you just come out the inside and there you go. Now it's blessed. That one's for the gods. Anyway.
Some instruments. Well, you know, we finally get a meaningful distinction between the lyre and the harp, and essentially, as we have come to discover ourselves, the lyre is the one with the sound box on it. The harp is the one without the sound box on it. Although sometimes the harp can have a small sound box on the bottom, and lyres can have a small sound box on the side. So the early distinction wasn't quite as clear, but it eventually becomes what we think of it. Now, the early poets improvised on both of these, both the lute and the lyre. You remember, we talked about the rhapsods and the OG Slam Poetry Fest and all that. These are the instruments that they would have been playing. But we're not going to listen to the lyre or the harp because we've just listened to it a number of times.
But the aulos is another very cool instrument from ancient Greek times. This is like, you remember those silver pipes from Ur?
Mm-hmm.
So this is kind of like that, only it's just a slightly different sound. It's a little cleaner, it's not quite as raw, and it looks and sounds like this.
The second piper is Callum Armstrong, who is an expert on the aulos and is going to demonstrate an improvisation on the instrument. We have some sense of the notated music that an aulos would have played, but essentially an expert piper like Callum needs to try and produce whatever sounds he can on the instruments that we have. And so here he's improvising and showing the kind of sounds that the two pipes together can make. So you'll notice that the techniques that are used by the pipers is circular breathing, where they're breathing in normally through their nose, they're holding the breath in their cheeks, and they're pushing it out. And at the same time, they are taking breaths in through their nose so that they can make a continuous sound, a bit like bagpipes, but doing it with their own bodies.
That was awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna basically say everything that the guy in the intro of the video is saying, how guy was using circular breathing.
Yeah.
It's essentially the proto bagpipe.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Very much like that, like he said with the drone. So what you may have noticed is that this is in what we would call the Dorian mode and what the ancient Greeks would have called the Phrygian mode. That was the mode that everybody thinks of as like the medieval sounding music.
Mm-hmm.
Could you get that?
Definitely.
We're going to hear that a lot. We're going to be living in that mode and some other very beautiful ones. Matter of fact, 7 other beautiful ones when we get to the Middle Ages.
Nice.
Yeah, it's really cool. So that's the aulos. And then there are some other ones. There are the kithara, the barbiton, and the psaltery. Again, we're not going to play these because we're trying to keep this as concise as we can. So the kithara is the ancestor of the guitar. It's the next thing after the lyre. The sound box develops a little bit more. The neck starts to narrow with the strings, and eventually an actual fretboard is attached, but that comes much later. The earliest kitharas were still more harp-like than guitar-like, but they lead to the guitar, so thank a Greek.
All right, will do.
So your guitars also come from your Greeks. Next, we have the baryton is the bass kithara. So the bass guitar, thank a Greek.
Awesome.
They had a psaltery, which we heard in that hymn to Zeus. They also created the familiar trapezoid psaltery, so the one that you normally think of as a psaltery. Thank a Pythagorean. More on that later. Listeners, as you know, we always link more than we can talk about here. So I have 2 more performances, one by Michael Levy as he performs on the kithara, and then one which is the barbiton of Sappho. I don't know if you've ever heard of Sappho, but she is the one from whom we derived the word sapphic, meaning of or related to lesbianism.
Oh, cool.
Yes, because Sappho was a lesbian poet who lived on the island of, wait for it,
Lesbos.
Yes, that is where we get the word lesbian. We're learning all kinds of things, aren't we? From the...
That is so cool.
Do you see why I said like I couldn't wait till we got to the Greeks?
Yeah,
like,
this is interesting.
They're fire, dude. Everything they did is just like direct impact right now. Still a thing.
Yep.
Sappho was awesome because here we are in this ultra masculine dominated culture, and she's like, hey, you guys want to just go off with the boys? Well, hey, we can do that too.
Girls' night.
Girls' night. Yeah, dude, it's really cool because her poetry is it's not just that it's very sensual, because it is. She knows how to really draw you in and create a mood. And she had, apparently it was this really one lover that she had, who she was truly crazy about, and mostly just about everything she wrote was for her. But, there's nothing cooler than a female bass player. I always like female bass players, probably because of Darcy from the Smashing Pumpkins, going back to that. But Sappho played the baritone. That was her instrument. So she was a bassist.
Nice.
Yeah. At any rate, you guys can hear that on your own. And Brody, you can hear that on your own. Finally, the last two instruments I want to talk about are the syrinx and the hydraulis. The syrinx, which some of you Rush fans might remember from the song Temples of Syrinx, is a panpipe. That's all. It's just a panpipe, the original name for it. Well, realistically, the panpipes don't start with the Greeks. They didn't originate that, but that was just something they did, and I thought I'd throw that in. And here's the last one, the hydraulis, right? So why stop at creating the ancestor of the guitar? What's the guitar without its best friend, arch nemesis, the keyboard? You gotta have keyboards if you got guitars, right? I mean, who else is gonna wrestle with the guitar and the lute for dominance over instrumental music for the last 1,000 years?
Right.
No, violinist, you stay out of this. You've already had your turn, and his turn, and her turn, and my turn, and everybody's turn.
Everybody's turn is taken up.
You've already taken everybody's turn. Look, we all know you actually run the show, okay? Everybody knows that. Even though you can't do a tenth of what the piano can, we all still love you for the crazy, passionate, daredevil superhero musicians you all are. And we know that. So
yeah, and fighting the devil.
Yeah, exactly. So look, we're just talking about the rest of us mortals here. That's all. So just take a deep breath and be at peace. You're not in this because you've already won this. Anyway, all violinists are divas, even the humble ones, and if they're not, they should be. So anyway, back to Greece. The hydraulis, my friend, is an ancestor of not only the pipe organ, but the keyboard itself. It's basically somebody said, what if we took a panpipes, that's why I mentioned the syrinx, what if we took a panpipes or a syrinx and we stuck it in this thing with a whole bunch of water that we can press keys down so we can actually blow air through the pipes with the water and make a really cool sound. And I'm going to show you what is labeled as a Roman hydraulis because it is indeed also played by the Romans, but don't sweat it because the Greeks had it too. In fact, the Romans got it from the Greeks. Come check this out. This is very cool looking.
I wonder if it's like the pyrophone.
Well, you're going to point out an interesting fact that I know is going to jump out to you right away that I left out.
That's a really neat instrument there. To play it, you need to use the buddy system.
Mm-hmm.
There's two people playing this instrument. One person is actually performing the musical notes on a keyboard, and another person is running a water pump, a manual hand crank water pump, and I assume that's to keep a constant pressure in the water chamber so that when the keys are depressed, it can push air up through those reeds.
Precisely. The Greeks were very clever.
That is very, very clever. That is cool. And it's all made of wood, too.
Yep.
That's so neat. I like that.
And you can see why the Romans would have been attracted to that with their interest in keen engineering and clever things like that.
Yeah, so we got the
The hydraulis.
The hydraulis.
Yep.
And at some point, I hope we cover the pyrophone, which is a version of that, but instead of using puffs of air, it uses fireballs in glass tubes to create certain tones.
Incidentally, that is extremely similar to the Caliope, which also uses fire to get a tone out.
Yeah, the Caliope.
And the Caliope, interestingly enough, is named after one of the daughters of Zeus, one of the muses, because all Greek stuff is fire.
It is.
Like, have we hit anything yet that has not been like pure fireballs with these people?
Not yet. Lyric poets.
So we mentioned before, and we touched on very briefly a few moments ago, hang on.
So if anybody notices any creaking noises, we do apologize. We are recording this from the Sultana ship located in Chestertown, Maryland. Not the best place to record a podcast, I will say, with all this electronic gear and an old rickety boat and all the creaking noises and the pirates outside, but we're doing our best.
Those are the pirates that abducted you the other weekend.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, when we get around to a composer who makes, like, I don't know, pirate-themed music, we should record an episode from a pirate ship.
We're probably not going to get anywhere near that until we hit the 20th century. Okay, so weirdest thing that's happened to me in the past couple of weeks is what happened just now, with the spirit of Hector Berlioz manifesting itself in my room, rising up out of a pile of ectoplasm that appeared randomly on the floor to tell me that he was going to drag my soul down to hell with him if I don't let you guys know that his opera, The Corsair, premiered in 1845. I don't know the month and I don't know the date, so hopefully that'll at least get me into purgatory. Realistically, the guy's probably just messing with me like he did the last couple times he showed up. But there was that one time when, actually, I better probably not mention that here. But let's just say I've learned to take the guy's threats seriously, so I'm not messing around. Anyway, Hector Berlioz, The Corsair, 1845. And God willing, we're both still alive by the time we get to Berlioz' episode, which I guess would be kind of weird if we weren't. We'll make it a point to record something about the Corsair on an actual pirate ship, if we can find one. There, you happy? You gonna stop hectoring me now? Oh, time to cut. But by then, we'll be so successful, and
we'll be able to afford to travel to a pirate ship and rent it out for the day.
We'll be making millions, man. We'll be...
Thousands.
Yeah, thousands even. Not just millions, but thousands.
Fives of thousands.
We'll be making tens and tens of dollars off of this thing.
Dozens.
Dozens of singles.
Dozens of monies.
Dozens of monies. We're going to make at least 25 cents.
Nice.
It's going to be sick.
Can't even buy a pack of Juicy Fruit with that now, dude.
No, but you can stare at it and look at it as a relic of a bygone era. I remember when this used to do something. Anyway, in our first background episode, we talked about how in ancient Greece there were these wandering poets called rhapsods who would write out these really long poems and then perform them in competition with one another for divine favor. And one of the things that got people really excited at these competitions was the rhyming and this idea of just being able to hold this constant flow of rhymes throughout an epic poem. When a poet could do that really well, people were absolutely spellbound by it. And people are still spellbound today by the very best of them, and that is, of course, Homer, who composed the Iliad and the Odyssey, the two great poetic works that tell many of the famous stories of the ancient Greeks and the gods. Even though it wasn't freestyled, and sometimes it was, they did do freestyle poetry, or at least we think that they did, but we also know that more commonly it was written out. But the idea was still that it had that flow that it could feel like it was just natural speaking. And now, oh my gosh. So obviously we've talked about it now, but you remember, I guess we could call it epic rhapsod battles of history, right?
Yeah, we could.
Well, so I didn't even make the connection initially to think of the slam poetry throwdown. I'm sure I would have if I thought about it long enough. But remember I said something that's going to make your jaw drop? You got to come see this.
It's the championship. We at this motherfucker. This what we came to see. You know what I'm saying? That's why the we in the D. We represent. We at the shelter, goddammit. It's real. I hope y'all ready. Each of these cats, they get $1.5 million apiece. I don't know what's gonna happen. We ready? You know what to do? DJ, kick that shit.
Skai astepilaskai purgon hikanen. Amparamin truonna lokhoit jonedet hygatres. Iromenai paidasteka signetuste taste. Kai posias odepetat vioise okest ajanogi. Pasas hexies polleiside kede prepto. Al hotede priamoi odomon perigalle hikanen. Xeste sait huseisite dyngmenon nautare nautoi. Pente kontene santalamoik xestoi olit hojo. Pläs jag jälle luondet mämenoi entrade paides. Kaimon topriamoi ja paramnestes alokoisin. Kuura on heterot hönen antioi endot hönaules. Dodeke santeke oit halamoikses toi olit hojo. Pläs jag jälle luondet mämenoi entrade gambroi. Koimon topriamoi ja paraidoi esalokoisin. Entä hoje piotorosen antie älytömeter. Laodi kännessä kuusat hyngat ruon edosaristen.
I don't remember that scene from 8 Mile, but all right, dude.
Dude, it blew my, like, literally when I saw this, I think I had a mild out-of-body experience because it was like, you described this exactly.
Exactly, yeah,
like
100%.
I mean, maybe it's obvious. Maybe I should have made the connection immediately, but now we can add to our list the epic rap battles of history. The slam poetry throwdowns had their antecedents in ancient Greece, and somebody else besides us apparently realized that.
Yeah.
Or besides you. I'm giving you all the credit for that one. That just, like, I was floored when I saw that. And yes, that was an excerpt from Homer's Iliad, and very along the lines of what we think it might have sounded like.
Genres.
They had a lot of them. We're not going to listen to any of them, at least not in this section. I'm just going to tell you that they had hymns, they had paeans, and they had all kinds of neat little things like that. Some of these are going to be directly relevant later to 14th and 15th century poetic forms, so I'm just mentioning them here. We will get to hear a paean at the very end, and we've already heard some hymns, but there are also something called dithyrambs, and again, I'm just not going into it here because we will actually have cause to go into it later, and I want to keep this concise.
Music theory.
And the reason we're not going to get into any of that other stuff is because this is actually more important to us right now, and it's more important to us in the long run. You see, all Western music theory goes back to ancient Greece. This is where everything that we are going to be talking about for the rest of this series in terms of music theory is finding its ultimate origin. So if there's any part of this episode to pay attention to, it's this part. This is the most important part. And it all goes back to Pythagoras. You see, Pythagoras was a mystic, a philosopher, a mathematician, and a music theorist who was born on the island of Samos in the Greek city-state of Ionia back in 570 BCE, and best known for his famous mathematical theorems. And he was a natural-born mystic with a very keen mathematical mind. Now, without going into the details of his bio, I feel like I say that a lot on this show, but without going into the details of his bio, he did go to Egypt, as we know, and he learned a lot of things, developed a lot of theories. Part of his theory was that he believed that numbers were spiritual forms, essentially pre-existing things. Like one was a thing. It was a thingness called one. And then if you had one of something, it was one of the one, of the original one. So the original one would be like the undivided essence, the original primordial oneness that all the universe was. Two was the next step, and two is two-ness. It means division. It can later mean complement by having a third thing. When we add three, the three is the thing between one and two that unites them. But what's interesting is one of the ways that you knew a Pythagorean brother, because I should say this, he went back home and founded a cult or mystery school. And it was all based on this theory of these numbers. And if you mentioned the number 2 around somebody, or somebody mentioned the number 2 around you, and you suspected that they might also be a Pythagorean, you would spit on the ground. And that was to show your disdain for this whole idea of division, because it's all false. There's really no division in the end. It's all just expressions of this one. Very deep, very thoughtful, and not the stuff that we typically learn about when we think about Pythagoras. We learn about the Pythagorean theorem, we learn about all this cool math stuff because it's groundbreaking and just absolutely foundational to mathematics. But what's lesser known to most people who know about Pythagoras, unless they are musicians, is that Pythagoras laid the groundwork, the framework for everything that we have in music theory today. And it all goes back to this theory of intervallic consonances. Basically, the legend goes like this. Pythagoras was walking past a bunch of metal workers one day, and they were all hitting anvils. And he noticed that the anvils made different pitches, obviously, depending on the size of the anvil. But it wasn't just that. He noticed very specific relationships. He noticed that the anvils that were exactly half the size of other anvils would make a pitch that was exactly twice the frequency. So he went home and he did some experimenting with something called a monochord. It's a single string stretched taut between two boards. And he realized that if he took this string and he divided it in half, the pitch would double. So let's say it was that 110 that we were talking about back in our Neolithic episode. If he divided that string right down the middle, each of those halves would vibrate at 220 hertz, the octave. So the octave is a 2-to-1 ratio between the halved string and the whole string. Now, the next thing he noticed is that if he was to divide the string into thirds, each third would create a 3-to-2 ratio with the original length of the string, aka a perfect fifth. We'll get to why it's called a perfect fifth when we get to about episode 7, but for now what matters is the ratio itself and the fact that Pythagoras is credited with figuring it out. And now, I've been looking forward for a while to showing both you and our listeners this little excerpt here. Because you remember in the first 2 episodes I mentioned we borrowed a lot from diacoustics. Well, I'm going to give you a sample of diacoustics so you guys out there can hear just how amazing he actually is. He is going to describe, I think, better than anybody I ever have heard, even though apparently he got this from Adam Neely. He is going to describe in a very succinct way exactly how beats relate to pitch and interval. And you're going to hear how everything that we think of as notes and the relationships between notes ultimately starts as beats. And I'm just going to let him explain this to you.
Now, in the sounds of the animal world, we find what are often described as the building blocks of music, rhythms, tones, and harmonies. And these can be understood in a way to all be the same sort of thing. They are repeating symmetries in time. The only difference is the speed at which they occur. If we start with a series of audible clicks repeated at a steady rate, we perceive this as a rhythm. In fact, it's the simplest rhythm we can think of, a pulse. Now, if we take this pulse and start to speed it up, we eventually no longer hear the individual beats, but rather a continuous tone. and we start to perceive changes in the speed of the pulsation as changes in pitch. When it speeds up, it goes up in pitch. When it slows down, it goes down in pitch. Now, we can extend this example of how rhythmic patterns and tones are related to begin to consider the rudiments of harmony too. Now that we have this tone that we've created out of a series of beats, if we play the same pattern alongside it, but repeating at twice the speed, we get a second tone an octave higher, a ratio of 2:1. If we start again with the same pulsation and play alongside it a second beat at 3/2 the speed, so a ratio of 3/2, the rhythm sounds something like this. When these two are sped up, we get the first tone and the second tone forming the interval of the perfect fifth. We can do the same with a ratio of 3/4, and we get the perfect fourth. And we can continue in this way all the way down the Pythagorean intervals. And each time the rhythm gets gradually more complex, and this is correlated with harmonic complexity. The more discernible the rhythmic pattern between them, the more harmonic the two resultant tones sound to us. Rhythmical unity maps onto harmonic unity. If we start from a very complicated polyrhythm or polychrony, where it is more difficult for us to pick out where the rhythm repeats and what its overall structure is, then we find equally that the resulting tones sound quite dissonant together. If we push this example even further and do the same thing but with a random set of beats that are not organized into regular pattern, then we end up with a more noisy signal.
What did you think of that?
That just blew my mind, man.
Yeah.
Like, I always knew that if you were to repeat a sound, you know, like the sound of a drum going off and repeat it faster and faster and faster, eventually it becomes a tone and your brain will stop hearing the individual beats and it just becomes one singular tone. But hearing it explained like this, and especially with the multiple tones, like the beats that were going faster and slower than each other, and they harmonize when they go up and down, that was awesome.
Yeah. So do you see why I've been harping on everybody listening to diacoustics? You know, he draws you in. He's very hypnotic speaking, and then he explains these things, and you feel like you walk away like you know something that you did not know before. And I've known this for years, but hearing somebody actually explain it like that and play it so simply, You know, even if Adam Neely goes into a lot more detail, I like that this is so concise, because in the space of about 3 minutes, he just explains something that a lot of people have a very hard time understanding when it's just described conceptually.
Yeah.
So there's that. And the last thing we'll say about this is that there's a reason these intervallic ratios show up. And that's because every single tone that we play, with the exception of a sine wave, which is an artificially created tone, every single tone has a series of overtones, and it's the same series of overtones. So if you play a low E on your guitar, you're not just hearing that low E. More quietly, you're also hearing the octave E above it. And then more quietly than that, you're hearing the B above that, the perfect fifth. And then more quietly above that, you're hearing the A, the perfect fourth. And these notes, which become ever quieter as you go up the series, are called overtones, because they're literally the tones that you are hearing over the tone that you played. In technical terms, they are also known as partials with respect to a fundamental tone. Every single solitary pitch causes the vibrating medium to vibrate at different nodes, and those nodes are always going to be correlated with this overtone series. Now, the reason we have different sounding instruments, different timbre of instruments, is because the overtones do not always come out at the same intensity. Certain instruments will have overtones that pop out a little bit more. Certain instruments might have, let's say, the third partial pops out a whole lot, and the second one actually pops out a little quieter. Or the seventh and eighth partials might ring out more strongly than usual, and they might have a certain kind of interaction with other partials because they're vibrating differently. So then that sets other partials to vibrating differently. And that's why if you play a C natural on a trumpet, let's say you play a C4 on a trumpet, and you play a C4 on the piano, they're going to sound different from one another, even though they're the same note. And our ear will recognize that it's the same note, but it's a different material creating that note. And that's because the nature of the material determines how the overtones will be produced. And that is the main reason why the Greeks matter to us. If nothing else, they gave us that, and that's our starting point for everything that we're going to learn in this series. Like, that's heart and soul, the core of it. But there's one last thing I want to talk about, actually two more things with the Greeks before we wrap up. First of all is that there does appear to have been a cultural shift. Sometime after Homer, after Pythagoras, the modes changed, or it seems like there was like a crossing, a mixing of modes, and people were getting a lot more interested in improvisation and complex emotions and things like that. And one guy named Plato was not amused. He was not happy with it. He wanted the modes to be what they used to be. He said it used to be people would go and they would sit in silence and they would listen to a piece of music and they would reflect on it. And the modes were what they were supposed to be. There weren't no happy lyrics over a sad mode. You didn't do that. Or vice versa. So, Pink Floyd and the Smashing Pumpkins, you guys, you're breaking the law. You can't sing sad lyrics over a happy melody. That's not right. You know what he felt like? He thought it was like, you're lying to me. You're not telling me the truth. Your music is saying one thing and your words are saying another. This is deceitful music and it's dangerous because it's deceitful. And then the showiness, he felt like you're making it about you, not about the music. And we still sometimes feel that way. When we hear a singer who's just all over the place with melismas and it's like, yeah, you've got an amazing voice. You can do that. You can shred. Okay, you got it. But where's my Star Spangled Banner, man? Another thing that seemed to be going on in his time was people were making very loud and crazy noises and using a lot of noisy sounds to capture the attention or to start something off, like to kick off a play. So again, I'm not going to play you the instrument because I want to keep it rolling, but there's an interesting instrument called a kanun that we will be linking to. And if you want to hear somebody shred the life out of the kanun like nobody's business, you're going to hear it on this video. The kanun is also kind of like the psaltery that we were describing. It's basically that instrument. But it's just somebody playing it so fast that it's almost obscene. The video has 1 like. It was from me. So help the guy out. It's been up for 9 years, for God's sake. Seriously, just go to the video. Just find it. It just says Kanun, K-A-N-U-N, in our links. Go there and like the video. I want to surprise this guy. After 9 years, somebody likes it and then like 2 or 3 other people. If you have time.
Music and drama.
So we've already touched on this briefly. But of course, the Greek drama is the ancestor of the opera, and it is for a number of reasons. Now, it seems like in the earliest forms, especially with tragic drama, there was only one actor on the stage who performed all the parts, and then there was a chorus behind them that commented, that was like the narrators. Like they narrated what was going on and then the actor would act out all the roles. And over time, they started bringing in other people onto the stage. And if I understand correctly, I believe that it was always an all-male thing. I think males played the female roles, which is partly why the later Romans felt that it was effeminate to be an actor. And they thought that if you were acting or playing music professionally, it was kind of like being a prostitute because you were using your body to entertain people. And it was kind of girly. So, the Romans had, they had their issues. I love my Romans, but they had their issues. So that is one thing about it. And we know that there were very famous playwrights. The beginning of being a famous playwright started in ancient Greece. So if you are a playwright, all you Broadway cats out there, thank a Greek. It's everything. Like I said, you see why I said you can't just touch on one thing. It's everything they did. It's all directly relevant. So I'm going to show you. This is funny because a little while ago on another episode, I said it was not too long ago that you could find fairly reputable scholars saying not a note of music from the ancient world has come down to us. Well, we know that's BS. We're very clear on that now. But specifically, he said the plays of Euripides are completely silent. And very specifically, the plays of Euripides are not silent because, as we're about to discover in a moment, the ancient Greeks did something very, very kind for us. We've seen it happen a couple of times in history. It's going to happen this time, and then it's going to happen one more time after this for our purposes. Yes, the dawn of notation. And this time, it's not just one piece, Brody. We have from about 250 BCE to about 200 CE, 11 surviving fragments, and some of them are complete, of actual real deal ancient Greek music. And we have multiple treatises that explain how to interpret this. There is still some wiggle room, but it's nothing like with the Hurrian hymn where it was you really have to understand some very deep things about the notation and kind of deduce a lot from that one set of instructions. There's still a lot of filling in the gaps. With the Greeks, there's filling in the gaps, but nowhere near as much because it's just a lot better explained. They were very technical, and that's why we love them. So one of the fragments may have been, a couple of the fragments, two of them, may have been written either by Euripides himself or by a composer that Euripides had writing the music for his plays. Because we actually have, according to these fragments, if the Greeks were not lying to us, we have music from the play Orestes by Euripides. And we're going to hear a couple of things from it. First, I'm going to show you the Orestes Stasimo, and then at the end of this, I will show you the Orestes chorus. This is the Stasimo, which is the intro, the very opening of the play Orestes by Euripides. That's the real thing. Not an interpretation, not a reconstruction. That's the music they gave us. That's the melody.
Very nice.
Yeah. It's one of the more famous ones. I'm going to show you 3 more, and then that's going to be a wrap for today. So I want to show you the first Delphic hymn to Apollo. And the reason I want to show you the first Delphic hymn to Apollo is because this may be the earliest piece of music that we have with the named composer.
Ooh, yeah.
Because we know that either Athenaeus or Limenius was the earliest named composer. Because Athenaeus wrote the first Delphic hymn and Limenius wrote the second. But it appears that maybe Limenius was before Athenaeus, and so it was just mistakenly called the first Delphic hymn. So Limenius may have been the earliest with the second Delphic hymn to Apollo. But if not, then this piece by Athenaeus was the earliest. And I just like this one better, so I'm just going to say I don't know that it's the earliest, but it is one of the 2 earliest pieces by a named composer. And this is the first Delphic hymn to Apollo by Athenaeus. Editing Ronnie here. Just want to point out something significant that I must have mentioned to Brody during one of the points where we had paused the recording to take a break, because I can't find it anywhere in here. It's important to know when listening to this that the performers are working from a single melody with a text. In other words, all of the instruments that you're hearing are the decisions of the performers themselves. They're not specified in the written notation in the pieces that survive. Now, that doesn't mean no instrumentation was intended. That was the decision of whoever was putting on the play or who was making those musical choices at the time. The melody is just there to tell the arranger what the tune is. That is, if there is to be any instrumentation at all. With some of these pieces, like the Euripides, we know that there must have been some kind of instrumentation because that's how they did the plays. Whereas with this first hymn to Apollo, it could very well have just been chanted solo. At any rate, the performers here are trained scholars, so their choices of instrumentation are based on the knowing of stuff. And not just any stuff, relevant stuff that makes their choices plausible. This is a situation we will encounter again when we reach the lyric poets of the Middle Ages, so I wanted to point it out now just so you know how scholars usually approach these things. Anyway, back to those other clowns. To me, the thrill is in knowing that we know the name of the composer.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Like, it's not quite the same as knowing who he was, and I think there might be a little bit of information on him, but not much. And obviously, there's a reason that we're not counting these guys in our series, and that's because even though they are part of the ancestral tradition to Western classical music, by our definition, it doesn't start until we hit Gregorian chant.
Yeah.
But for now, I want to play you 2 more Greek pieces. This one is called The Epitaph of Cyclos. And Cyclos was the wife of this anonymous composer who wrote this. This is the most famous piece of ancient Greek music. If you ever hear somebody playing examples of what ancient Greek music is, chances are they're going to play this piece and this performance.
Ikon ilithos imi, Τήθης μη σίκυλος εν θαμνήμης αθανάτου σήμα πολυχρόνιον. Σίκυλος εύτερπου. Τσι.
So for our last piece of music for the day, we're going to be checking out the Orestes chorus. And this is the one that I mentioned earlier. It's a chorus, but also you will hear it with the aulos. So remember, the aulos is two pipes that you play at the same time. You're going to hear one is often used as, not even as a drone. These are offset by one whole tone. So I don't remember the exact tunings, but if one of them was C, D, E, F, the other one would be D, E, F sharp, G. So it's the same exact tuning, but one's a whole tone higher, because they thought of the major second harmony, what we would think of as a harmony, as consonant. Now I know I've said they didn't have harmony, but the simultaneous sounding of these two intervals. So it's not like chordal or harmony as we understand it, but it's sort of an ancestor to that.
So the final piece is a chorus from Euripides' Orestes, in which the young Orestes is being chased by the furies of his mother, these spirits of vengeance. This is perhaps the most exciting piece of music that survives from antiquity. It's on a papyrus about 2 inches square. There's Greek writing on it, which is the text of Euripides' Orestes, a chorus from that, a few lines of it. Above that writing there are these symbols which are the melodic notes to which that text was set. So the finale of this performance is the reconstructed version of the chorus from Euripides' Orestes.
So yeah, that's a little overview of most of the things that the ancient Greeks gave us.
Beautiful. There's so much information. I loved it. And they really are tied to just about everything we do in the modern age.
Yep. And so the last thing I want to say to leave this off is that around the time that this music was being composed, or at least some of it, and I should say that the Orestes could go back to like 400 BC, which is pretty cool. Mm-hmm. So even though it was written down around 250 BC, it could be significantly older, which is very cool. And remember, things could stay popular for a long time back then. It's because time moved slower in a way. But anyway, around this time, the ancient Greeks were in Israel and causing a whole lot of problems for the Jews, as we talked about last time. So how on earth are these two cultures ever going to come together to form the seed of Western classical music? Well, to answer that question, you'll have to come back next week when we finally tackle our last background episode. The final one. We're just about there, Brody.
Almost there.
Almost
there.
We are so close. And that next background episode is going to tell you how these two strains converged sometime around the 2nd and 3rd centuries and led to a wonderful proliferation of chant traditions all across Europe. And if I say anything else, it'll be spoiling. So I think that we were pretty concise today. I think we got this all right.
Yeah.
So, all right, cool. Well, guys, we're going to wrap up here. We want to let you know that by the time you get this, everything should be quite up and running. But go ahead. What did you do, Brody? You worked on something recently.
Let's see. I got the Instagram and the Twitter up. I should be getting some form of content up on them this weekend. Cool. And yeah, they should be functional, more or less.
Excellent. We also recently ran into a little issue with our website, but we should be back up and running by the time you get this. And very likely we should have our Patreon up and running as well. So this is it. I can't believe it, but we're really, really close.
Getting there.
Like, we are so close now. Next time we briefly touch on the Romans, then it's early Christian chant straight up to the year 754. So, and with that, I guess all there's left to say is...
The Greeks did everything.
Yep. Okay, we're good. And lo, we have reached the outro music. This is usually the part where I would say something funny, clever, or strategically stupid to send you all off with a glide in your stride, a smile on your lips, and a dip in your hips. But I'm sure you can't believe it, I've actually got nothing left to say, other than to remind you to check out the Mendelssohn variations, and to say thank you to our newest patrona della arte, Ashley Fisher. Great to be at your service, Ashley. And we are psyched to be getting the first Patreon bonus episode up within the next couple of weeks. So look forward to that. Okay, everyone. Till next time. But lest we get ahead of ourselves, let's have a quick look at the ancient Gex.
Hey, you little piss, baby. You think you're so f***ing cool, huh? You think you're so f***ing tough? You talk a lot of big game for someone with such a small truck. Oh, look at those arms. Your arms look so f***ing cute. They look like little cigarettes. I bet I could smoke you. I could roast you. And then you'd love it. You'd text me I love you. And then I'd f***ing ghost you. The big boys coming with the big stuff. I feel so clean like a money machine. Oh, yeah. Big boys coming with the big truck. Feel so clean like a money machine. Oh, yeah. Big boys coming with the big truck. Feel so clean like a money machine. Oh, yeah. Big boys coming with the big truck. Feel so clean like a money machine. 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 Tell me what to do. I've been trying to go to bed. I've been up for days. Been trying to get it right. Said it all before. I'll say it once again. I'm better off alone.
Yep, enough of that.
Excuse me, the ancient Greeks. But hey, now that you've actually heard 100 Gex, I gotta ask you an important question. Who do you think would win in a fight between 300 Spartans and 100 Gex?
100 Gex, because as soon as the Spartans hear that music, they'll just jump themselves off a cliff right onto their spears.
Yeah, I
like
think
a giant Spartan kebab.
Spartan kebab. Ooh. Yeah, 100 Gex is very much an acquired taste.
Yeah, I wish I had the technical know-how how to build a time machine so I could go back 2 minutes to a point in time before I knew that hyperpop existed, because that was probably the best time of my life.
Yeah, now you'll never be able to get that memory out of your head.
Nope.
It's like you're going to define your life from before and after I played that to you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know.
The ancient